Bum 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 ba-dum ba-dum bum 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 ba-dum ba-dum bum 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 ba-dum ba-dum bum 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 ba-dum ba-dum bum.
I'm Allie.
And I'm Gabby. And we're real-life sober BFFs exploring spirituality,
Social issues,
all things sobriety,
and staying present in a world full of distractions.
Come join us on this journey.
We've been waiting for you.
Bum 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 ba-dum ba-dum bum 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 ba-dum ba-dum bum 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 ba-dum ba-dum.
I want to apologize in advance for some technical difficulties. You may hear some cutting out with the recording on my end, coming at you from Vietnam when I'm recording, so I do apologize, but please continue to listen and enjoy the content.
Hello, and welcome. Today we are moving into part of the series on discussing whiteness and wellness and some difficult topics. So I do want to just start with a disclaimer, letting everyone know that there might be some sensitive subject matter and emotional topics. If that's something that you're not prepared to dive into right now, maybe come back and visit this episode at a later time. So joining us today, Fancine, she's a yoga teacher in New York City. Fancine, how are you today?
I'm doing well. Thank you very much. Great weather in New York. Just pleasant.
Awesome. Is it really?
Yeah, it's like there hasn't been any snow on the ground all winter. We're not getting a winter yet this year.
Oh, wow. Okay,
Yeah.
That's awesome. So can you tell me a little bit more about yourself?
I've been living in New York for about 21 years now. I'm originally from Montreal. So French Canadian, I speak both languages, but I've been in New York. I've been a teacher for 8 years, a little over 8 years now. I like to combine different modalities to make it a little bit more inclusive, a lot of breath work, a lot of heart-opening work. Not sure what else to add. And I really, 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 really enjoy what I do.
That's good.
Yeah.
Thanks for being So also joining us today, we have Shri, and she is also a yoga teacher. And she's trauma-informed, and she's living yoga beyond asana, which is the postures. So, and you studied in Rishikesh, which is where I received my yoga training. Love it. And also studied Ayurveda, which is beautiful. How are you today, Shri?
I'm good. I'm happy to be here and having this conversation. So thank you for the invitation.
You're so welcome. Can you share a little bit more about yourself?
Sure. So my name is Shri. I am a yoga and meditation teacher at Third Root Community Health Center here in Brooklyn. I also leading different kinds of trauma-informed wellness practices here in New York City. And I'm originally from California, and so I've lived all over. And one of the things that living all over has taught me is how to really have a grounding spiritual practice. And so that's why I practice yoga and why I teach.
Awesome. So I'm so happy to have you both here today. And again, if you're still listening and you're not ready to dive into some sensitive topics and maybe emotional topics, definitely come back and visit this episode later on, and when you're ready to receive what's going to be shared here. So we're going to go ahead and get into the questions. I want to ask you both how you've experienced whiteness in the wellness space. And I'm going to expand on that a little bit because there are some specific topics that I want to address. But what have you experienced as far as like white privilege, exclusion, and maybe the silencing of people of color in the wellness community?
Shri, I'll let you tackle that first.
Okay, thank you, Francine.
Yeah.
I think first and foremost, when I think of wellness and specifically on this topic, whiteness and wellness spaces, I'm constantly met with the assumption that there is a link and that only white people or whiteness as a construct is something that deserves to be centered in wellness. So when you don't embody that in any way, or you don't have access and to those types of resources, it's almost as if you're not welcomed authentically into wellness, or that your wellness is not prioritized, or it's somehow your fault that you are seeking wellness or don't have that in your life as readily as other people. I think personally, for me, when I go to yoga spaces, particularly, I'm constantly met with assumptions about ability, about value, about are you lost? You know, not even, I don't lead with credentials. I'm just like, I'm here to take a class, or I'm curious about the program. And there's already check marks that people are doing in their head around their assumptions of my value or my interest. So I see that constantly from a personal perspective, and then I hear it a lot from my students who don't feel like they're welcomed in wellness spaces, no matter the modality. So yeah, it's something that is quite prevalent, and even having these conversations, I think, is really important, because I don't know if most people would be open to admitting to some of their unspoken biases around wellness and whiteness. So.
Yes.
Nice. I agree with a lot that you said, Shri. I was going to also say, as a teacher, and this happens to me quite a bit, because I usually stand at the front desk as students are being checked in. And sometimes, a lot of times you get students that have never come to your class before, you know,
Right.
And even though, you know, we use pictures so people know who's teaching the class, a lot of the times I get students, white students, who don't greet me. I'll say, hi, how are you doing? You know, and they'll, you know, look at me like they've never seen me before. They'll look at me twice and kind of strange. And then I'll walk into the room to teach the class, and then it clicks on, oh, you're the teacher. And then that same conversation of ability, how is this class going to be, you know?
Right.
The assumption of how I'm going to teach. And then usually at the end of the class, that same student that didn't greet me or has that look on their face throughout class will come up to me afterwards and be like, that was a great class. And in my head, I'm like, I know it was a great class, but I'm glad that you agree that I was able to teach you something, or you were able to take something from me.
I can't agree more. Like, there's, I sometimes will get asked about where I learned yoga, what, you know, they want my like resume, even amongst like class, you know, other class attendees. And I'm thinking, you don't ask other people here for where they learned or where they were trained. And so it's almost this validation process that happens. I also too have had students question, well, when is the teacher going to be here? And I'm like, I'm standing in the front of the room prepared for class. And that happens, unfortunately, quite a bit.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, it's almost like being a second class citizen within the world of yoga.
Mm-hmm. Or even in the space, you know, because where I am here in Brooklyn, there's a lot of gentrification happening. And so where I teach has been open for 12 years. And I've been there over 8 of those 12. And even still, I constantly get asked and get tested, you know, in ways I don't see other teachers, especially if we're talking about whiteness in wellness centers. I don't see other white teachers being asked.
Right. My main studio that I teach at, Sacred Brooklyn, we're in the Village, and we're also in Fort Greene. We started in Bed-Stuy on Clifton.
Bed-Stuy. Yeah,
and
I'm familiar.
Okay, I taught there for 8 years now, and that was that's one of the first studios that I've never been questioned, mainly because it's very open to people of color, and mostly students of color go there. Mostly Black students go there. So it makes a big difference in community. It's not until I started branching out and started teaching in other studios that I was met with that resistance.
Interesting.
Yeah. You know, or being a student going to studios. When I first really started practicing, being the only Black face in the room was uncomfortable. But after a while, I was like, you know what? I'm not here for anybody else. I'm here to heal myself.
Right.
And having to like put the blinders on and just do my practice. You know,
so I think
and most of the time you don't make friends. No, go on.
Yeah. No, I was going to ask if you've experienced students coming to you for resourced knowledge, like where can I go where I don't have to be othered or fetishized? Because I know I get that a lot from students who have shared with me that they don't feel comfortable coming to a class setting. And so I think one of the things that this question around whiteness shows up is that folks don't tend to pay a lot of attention to the additional emotional labor it takes for POC or whatever your embodiment is to come out and be in space together.
Right,
and
being
I think
comfortable.
And I think there's a lot of power in collective healing, but unfortunately, I feel that that's a hurdle that, you know, people have to contend with. I know I do when I think about going to a class that I'm unfamiliar with, the teacher, the space. It's like, do I feel like doing this today? You know?
Right.
Yeah.
Lots of research. But there's a few places. Brooklyn we're lucky. We live in Brooklyn. There's a lot of Black owned studios.
Yeah.
And that's making a big difference. But it also comes down to economics. If you don't have $25 to pay for a class every time you want to go to class, or you know, $200 to pay for a membership a month, it becomes restrictive, you know.
But I think that's also one of the things that, you know, we're talking about today as far as the construct of whiteness. Like there is an economic, almost privileged aspect that people think, oh, I can afford these classes, I can afford these yoga pants, I can afford, you know, not thinking like that is so far removed from what I was taught as, you know, the essence of the practice. And to see it commercialized and commodified really speaks to, I think, a wider conversation around ancestral practices getting whitened, I guess.
It's the hijacking of different cultures and taking them and turning them into commercial practice and leaving behind all of the substance and the deeper parts that belong with the practice.
And the purposeful exclusion, right? You know, there's definitely that happening for a lot of different reasons. So to say that that's not happening is really negating a lot of people's experience.
I partially agree. Maybe because of the whole community in Sacred that I found, the training that I did there. A lot of us were taking teacher training. The very first training that Sacred did, we were 17 students, and there were 3 white people out of the 16 who took that class, who took that first training. So there's a lot of us in Sacred. But now that we've kind of hooked up, we bought this other studio in the city, and this is where we're starting to confront a little bit of the pushback. We didn't have it in Brooklyn. We're having it in Manhattan. Because the studio was owned by actually an Asian woman, and having that pushback of, you know, other coming into the studio, they're not quite sure how to wrap their minds around it.
Yeah. And I definitely think being in Brooklyn is a beautiful, like, moment and an opportunity to see what it can look like, you know, a more inclusive environment in these spaces. I just have to share from my experience, having lived
Definitely.
in five different places, that
Mhm.
is it's an exception to the
Oh,
rule.
it definitely is. It
And
definitely is.
I just want it to keep growing, because I think in, you know, the 20 something years I've been practicing yoga, almost 13 teaching, I definitely have seen an increase in, obviously with social media also coming on board, I've seen an increase in widening, you know, the audience of who
Mhm.
is teaching, who is
Right.
attending, and who's interested. So that's one of the reasons why I think this conversation and others are so important, because it is isolating sometimes, especially as a teacher of color,
Yeah.
unless you're in places like Brooklyn or, you know, a big city.
Right. Right. Agreed.
So this is
Agreed.
a perfect segue into the next question.
Cool.
Talking about socioeconomic factors and exclusion in general. For example, if a Black body fits the economic status threshold for inclusion into this space, they show up, they have the money to attend, they have the pants or whatever, they fit, you know, every other embodiment of what this space is open for, I guess. What does that mean for communities where it's not accessible, where wellness services are not accessible, whatever that looks like? And what does it mean for the people who are able to be included in these spaces where the rest of the community isn't feeling welcome?
That's a good question. There's not a lot of studios that that offer community classes where you can come in for free and check out a studio. Once again, I'm going to talk about Sacred, because that's one of the things that we did every Saturday at noon. We had a free class, and those classes were filled with people of color who couldn't go to class, who couldn't afford to pay the $20 or $25. So it was an opportunity for these students every week to at least get some kind of practice in. But that's rare. It's really rare. It's very few studios would be willing to like give up a prime spot on a weekend for people who didn't have the money to come in and take a class.
Yeah. I can certainly agree. I know that one of the things we do where I teach is we have affinity classes, and we do have community classes that stay on the schedule every week.
Right.
And it is a fight sometimes to keep that programming intact, especially as the demographics change in the neighborhood. But one of the things I know, and one of the biggest reasons why I teach here, is because it's part of the mission and vision and values of the space, and that is
Right.
really centering. I don't like to use the word marginalized communities, because it's like, to me, a context of like, oh, we're off on, you know, on the margins, but it's a reality. And I think it fits for this conversation, but centering communities that may not necessarily have resources or are under-resourced from a systemic perspective.
Yeah.
And yeah, I think that it's important. I think every space should have a sliding scale, or what we call justice pricing.
Right.
I think every space should have a system or a business model that really supports all the layers of the socioeconomic scale, because it's not even just about price. Sometimes it's about, you know, ableism, and can people get into the space? Can people feel comfortable in the space?
Right.
So I think that those are also factors to think about.
Yeah, agreed. Another one of the studios that I work at, Shambhala, that's in Crown Heights, or Pacific Heights as it's been reframed. We used to have a community class there, but barely anybody attended. You would get maybe 5 or 6 people. So it's also getting the word out there that
Yeah.
these things exist. But the great thing about Shambhala is that they've kept their price low enough that students and people who couldn't really afford to pay $20 a class can pay $15 a class or
Yeah.
$10 a class. You know, you're a student, you
Yeah.
pay $10 a class. Like, make it affordable so you can come in and at least get some healing, get some breathing,
Right.
be able to come into your body, you know? So Deanna Green, I'm really grateful for that, you know, and Dara Cole at Sacred, so grateful for her as well, that they offer these things to the community.
Yeah, and I'm sure it's at a price as well, because you know
for sure.
just the economics of being in this city and having a business and run, you know, paying
the
rent.
Yeah, you got to pay the rent.
Paying the teachers, and that's another thing I think comes up when thinking about whiteness and wellness. You know, do teachers get paid, you know, equitably across the board?
Teachers get paid equitably. I think that's the next conversation. That's a huge conversation to have about teachers getting their fair wages, you know?
Yeah. But I know where I teach, we have a policy of NOTA, which stands for No One Turned Away for lack of funds. And that is like across the board on a lot of our programming, because we don't just do yoga. You know, we also have acupuncture, herbal medicine, and massage. So folks are coming into the space for a lot of different reasons and from a lot of different backgrounds.
Okay,
so
that's great.
You know, something to note.
Yeah, it's great.
Yes. And I love that you mentioned equity, because that is what is important. Having equal access doesn't mean that it's still accessible. You know, if you have like one price, that doesn't mean that it's still accessible for someone else. So it's very, very important. So yes, I think that everything that you ladies stated is right on point. So I think you really on the question, you guys, so you may not be prepared, but I wanted to ask about accessibility as far as the spaces being available in certain areas. For example, if there is no physical structure in a place that someone can get to, let's say they don't have a vehicle, they have to use public transportation. If there's nothing that's within that center, what does that mean for that community to not even have access to a building, even if they had the funds, if they had the knowledge of classes being available? If it's not accessible, let's say because of transportation issues, what does that mean?
Wow. Is that question answerable? I think there's a lot of, I think sometimes if you can't get to a studio, then DVDs, YouTube, other ways of getting Gaia, you know, there's other ways to access. But a lot of the teachers who are teaching these classes are not teachers of color.
Yeah.
You know?
I do know that I just came across, I know Jessamine Stanley started an app specifically
perfect
with that in mind, because there's so many asks for, I can't get to class, I really want to take a class with you. And I'm just like, oh, that's genius. In this way, social media can be helpful and can open the doors of access to people who may not, for various and sundry reasons, get to a class. So, you know, there's that.
Yeah, it's really research.
Yeah.
Spending a lot, like Googling and finding, and, you know, YouTube, going down that wormhole, because that can turn into, you know, 3 hours of watching videos. Just finding what works, you know, and it's nice to get into a class, but ultimately yoga is really about your own practice. It's nice to have a teacher to correct you, to make sure that you're doing it right. And that can go into, you know, privates, but you can always access it through either social media or online.
Yeah, I have to say that, there is so much value I know that I still get from having that teacher student relationship with my teachers.
Yeah,
So I can, on one hand, say digital access is available and it's wonderful and I think it's useful and it has a place, but there's also too a lot of value in that direct relationship as well.
I
And the
agree. But
energy of the
I think
space.
yeah, and I think for some people, they have to start somewhere.
Yeah,
So,
absolutely.
YouTube and DVDs help you at least get some kind of feedback. So when you walk into a space, when you're talking to a teacher, you have the
Yeah,
language.
absolutely. If that's your entry point, for sure. Yeah,
Yeah,
if
yeah,
that's where you've got to go, definitely do it.
yeah, yeah.
Yes. So we've been talking a little bit about social media and digital access and things like that. And again, I think this leads a little kind of into our next question. Cultural bypassing and lack of acknowledgement for Indigenous practices when engaging in ceremonies. I've been seeing in communities a lot of like cow ceremonies coming up where people using the word shaman, but they maybe don't have a background really in actually communicating with these cultures that are the keepers of all this knowledge in a sacred ceremony. What has your experience been maybe seeing some of that happening, and as more of these practices become more like mainstream and these things are kind of popping up, have you been witness to any of this kind of cultural bypassing and silencing of these Indigenous cultures and people of culture who hold these sacred ceremonies?
Uh, yes, yes.
I'll let you go first.
Yes, all the way across the board. Like even Kemetic yoga that's being trademarked now. It's like it's Egyptian yoga. Yoga's been around even longer than India has been practicing yoga. It's oneness, but we like to label it and take it over and make it ours, which is fine, but we forget where it comes from. And that's so important that we need to, people really need to do their research, and most people don't. They just take it at face value and think that this is the way it always was. Yoga mats. Back in the day, people used to do yoga on towels or just on the floor.
On the earth.
Exactly. Exactly. You get stronger legs. You're more connected than using like a $200 mat or $80 mat, But it becomes a status symbol, these things.
Yeah. I think, go ahead.
Too expensive. Oh, keep going. Yeah, take it from me because I can talk about this forever.
I think this is part of the biggest reason why I wanted to have this conversation is the cultural bypassing piece, because for me, it is like so critical to address it. And it's hard to address it when it happens. I guess because I've seen and practiced yoga in other places outside of the US, it is so critical to point out that there are more people around the world that may look more like me than folks here in the US who are practicing on these $200 mats. And there's nothing to be, well, I'm not going to lie, there's a whole lot to be said about that. But I think the cultural bypassing hurts from my experience when it's whitewashed as if these practices are something that was created by a white person in a yoga studio in the US. And there's this whole narrative that I've heard in teacher trainings where certain words are mispronounced, or there would be other like American Indian students saying that is not how you say that's not correct. And the facilitator saying you have it wrong. And I'm like, you're telling someone this is their lineage that they have their language, right? And so it just is so disheartening to see that. And I know that there are other folks, I'll let them tell their stories around how this happens and how especially teachers of color, get shut down in those conversations
Yes.
and in those spaces when there might be some pushback, like, yo, no, that's
Yeah.
incorrect.
Yeah.
And so
Right.
this like cultural bypassing and this whitewashing of an ancient practice just gets taught over and over and over. And it's like no one stops to question why, why aren't you questioning what you're learning? And like, you said
Right.
earlier,
Yeah.
do your research. It's maddening,
Yeah.
really.
Well, just like this whole conversation around, just like this whole conversation now that's happening about saying namaste, how that is being whitewashed. And do you end a class with a namaste, or should I do it, or am I by saying it, am I enabling, am I whitewashing, am I bypassing?
Yeah. And I think those are things that, are critical questions to keep asking, because there are certain situations and conversations I've been in where folks have asked me about being a Black person in this country. And I'm like, I don't speak, this isn't a monolith. I don't speak for all Black people. I can speak from my experience. And so to just keep asking the questions and keep having the conversations, and at a meaningful way, not just like superficial, like, we all are one, we all get along. Like, no, let's start dismantling some of these systems, because this is only, I think, a good way to start, making effective change. We can't keep having these little, superficial, surface level, we're all one conversations, because that to me is harmful, actually.
Right. The problem with yoga and studios is that a lot of people go in for exercise. They don't see yoga as anything deeper than the postures that they're doing and trying to perfect. And yoga is not about perfection or looking right or doing it right. It's at the moment, being in the moment, and not bypassing and pushing past your feelings. And that can be a lot of cultural bypassing as well, by just like, oh, I'm just exercising. And it's like, no, it's a little bit more than that.
That's one of the challenges I think we face now with social media and yoga, is that it's become so cool to like hit a cool pose or whatever.
Be by the beach in your little bathing suit,
It becomes
or doing the hardest pose.
Yeah, it's a competition.
Yeah. I tend to talk about that in class, that, I call it yoga porn. It's more than these images that we see. Once you get past your eyes, it becomes more about your heart, and to turn it more inwards than to always be looking out at what other people are doing on their mats. You pay $25, be here for you. Don't worry about what Sue's doing on the next mat and if she can do it better than you. Because if you're going to do that, then go home and look at it on, flip through Yoga Journal, or, throw on a DVD and watch, Rodney Yee do his thing. But, you're not here for anybody else.
I think that's one of the ways the whole system is being used to exclude and also center what is seen as beautiful. I've given talks before about how much I've grown to dislike yoga on Instagram, because, well, for a lot of reasons, but one of the things that I see as harmful and triggering for a lot of students is that there's this dialogue and narrative around, well, I can never do that or be like that, so therefore I can't do yoga.
Exactly.
One of the things, and I think that's on purpose, because again, there's this machine behind this business, and they want it to be practiced by a certain demographic. And to say that that's not the case is like, have you looked at social media? But I know I've had students come to class because they've gotten hurt trying to mimic or replicate what they've seen online, not giving credence to the fact that a lot of times these are dancers or gymnasts, or
Exactly.
there's a
Dancers.
whole backstory to why that person is in that pose, and that pose may not even be safe. So there's none of that.
Hyper flexible. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And then they're like, oh, I tore my ACL, or I did,
Well, yeah, it was like,
okay.
well, first of all, you need to warm up before you even get into these postures. It's not about standing on your head, really, or, doing the perfect crow.
Yeah.
If you don't have a strong core, or if you're not breathing properly, you're going to end up hurting yourself down the road, if not immediately. It's all about
why you want to get into the pose anyway.
Because you want to look good on Instagram.
Right. Is it just for the gram, or does that pose speak to you for something else? And this is why I always say I live yoga beyond the poses, because that is such a small part of the practice. And I think that the more I teach that and the more I talk about that, people are like, oh, well, what do you mean by that? I'm like, this is just a small part. But it's the biggest part that's been pushed. And that's when people think, oh, well, that's not for me. I don't have access to that.
Right.
So along the lines of that, you mentioned the machine and targeting certain demographics and making yoga a business, making wellness a business in general, because it's being marketed to a certain demographic because they have the funds to put back into this machine, right?
Right.
And so I just wanted to talk briefly about Jessamine Stanley fiasco with Yoga Journal cover. That was right after I subscribed to Yoga Journal, and I received the Jessamine Stanley cover. And there was a cover with a white woman that went out to a whole different sector of people. Instead of showcasing a queer, fat, black woman on the cover and just making that be, hey, this is also the standard. Like, this is also normal. This is also what yoga looks like. They decided to split the cover, and that had never been done in that capacity before. Apparently, it was like I just got into Yoga Journal at this point, but it was kind of eye-opening for me as someone who had just gotten into yoga in general to see that this system had already overtaken even just this culture of yoga in the United States, when I had the perception that yoga was not about that. And I was really, really surprised to see that it had already kind of been eaten alive by this consumerism, capitalism culture, and the systems that are in place to marginalize certain demographics.
Well, I do know that when I attended the Accessible Yoga Conference here in NYC, there was a representative from Yoga Journal there to speak specifically to this
what did they say? And what was the discussion? That's what I want to know.
Well, the thing I will say is that splitting the covers is actually not an uncommon thing in magazine world.
Yeah, they did it a lot.
But the way they did it, and the fact that Jessamine Stanley was not the only yoga teacher of color that they've done this to, that's why there's also, besides it just being atrocious, why it got so much traction, because this wasn't an isolated incident.
Not the first time. True.
No. And there were, teachers of color there, colleagues of mine, who were speaking up for, you did this to me as well. You asked me to be on the cover. You've given me this, highlighted spot, got everyone on board, and then you switched it up. So of course there was, we're going to do better. We're here to learn. We're here to listen. We're here, like all of that. But to hear that, you just got Yoga Journal and this happened is disheartening.
I also do have to say I used to be a subscriber to Yoga Journal, and it's a magazine. They're there to sell something, and mostly it's advertising and clothing. you know, after a year of flipping through that magazine, when the next year came on, it was the same nonsense all over again, just with different covers. And for me, once I've read it once, I was like, I'm good. I don't need to read it again. And I let go of my subscription. But that was years before they start putting, you know, people of color on the cover. And back in the day, it was even difficult to find a man on the cover.
Right.
You know,
Yeah.
so it excludes against Black people, but it also excludes against men because men practice. Why don't we put more men on the cover?
Yeah.
And I'm just being devil's advocate here. I like to.
Yeah, I don't have a real strong affinity to Yoga Journal just from a personal experience of being asked to do an article and putting in the work, submitting the article, and then nothing, you know. So
Wow.
already I just am like, you rely on the labor, but you don't trust the leadership. And there is an anti-Blackness sentiment that I got out of that experience for me. So
Right.
that's just, you know, to see what they did recently over the last year and a half to colleagues who are amazing yoga teachers and beautiful ambassadors to the practice.
It just seemed like they only did that split cover when there was a teacher of color, where they give people a choice. Do you want this cover or do you want this cover?
Yeah.
I've gotten the emails with the covers and been like, which cover do you like, cover A or cover B?
Yeah.
You know?
I think I agree. I also think, though, that they want the following of these teachers, social media and groups and you know, fans, I guess, and students, but
controversy sells.
Yeah, but they really prefer to keep their aesthetic the way it has been.
Because who buys that magazine? You and I both know they do a lot of research, and when it comes down to it, if it's controversial, people are going to pay attention, and you know, nobody really buys magazines anymore. So they can.
I didn't think that they bet on it being this controversial. They had to come out of pocket some money.
Yeah, I think it backfired a little bit what they were.
Yeah.
Oh, of course it backfires, but it gets people talking about Yoga Journal.
This is true. Here we are.
Yeah.
Here we are.
So we won't give them any more free advertising.
Granted.
So on to the next question, and this is something that I, in another podcast, also talking about healing spaces. Is self-segregation the answer to creating spaces for people of color to be able to come and show up and feel comfortable and not feel like they're fighting against fitting in a mold or having to do additional emotional labor just to show up and be on their mat and practice? And not just for people of color, but also for people of color who are part of the LGBTQ+ community, and creating these spaces within the Black community, you know, just to make room for people who don't fit this mold in the spaces where they've kind of hijacked the wellness part of the space.
If it gets people on the mat, yes.
Yeah.
I think it's very important.
Yeah, I've been on both sides of this conversation because, you know, holding space for POC classes, holding space for LGBTQ classes, holding space for abundant body classes, I'm constantly met with backlash of that's anti, you know, reverse racism, that's this, you know, I should be able to come to a class. And I think the biggest thing that I have as a response is, by these gatherings happening, they are not taking away from your access in any way, shape, or form. I think there's behind that ask a sense of entitlement to I should be able to go anywhere I want, and you have to let me in. But that's not the case for someone like me. I'm not welcome anywhere. So to say it's reverse racism, or to say that those spaces aren't sacred or don't have use, is foolish to me, because to be able to practice without being under the white lens is so very critical, not just for my own practice, but I know for a lot of people, to be able to let the mask down, even if it's just for an hour and a half or a couple hours, you know. And people will say, well, why don't you just practice at home? You can do that as well, but there's nothing like being in community. And we don't ever, you know, nix anyone else's need for community, whether it be a religious community or social community. Why is it such a problem for me to hold space for my community?
Agreed. Yeah, I definitely agree. And sometimes when it's a good starting point, a good jumping off point, when you come into a room and you see other people who look like you, and you're able to be comfortable and be yourself, then you can walk into any room and be yourself.
Yeah. It's critical. It's important. And I think it's a necessity for a lot of people. And it's not to say that you can't also go into mixed spaces, but I don't think anyone has the right to begrudge someone for creating or looking for space that feels safe for them. You don't get that right to tell me what I can and cannot do to make myself feel safe and be in my practice within my community.
Yeah.
Period.
I do have a few colleagues who refuse to teach regular studio classes with mixed races, where they just want to teach people who are different color, you know, people of color, LGBTQ, wow, having trouble speaking English now, but, you know, different bodied.
Yeah.
It's really important to let them know that, you know, just because you are, you know, you don't have your legs doesn't mean you can't do yoga. Yoga is more than asana. And making it as inclusive as possible around those who look like them. It's very, very important to walk into a room and be like, oh, I can be comfortable here. Oh, I don't have to hide. Oh, I don't have to spend half of my time in child's pose because I'm scared that people are staring at me, or they think I'm different and I shouldn't be there.
Yeah. I think, given the fact that a lot of my classes are trauma-informed based, I think for me, it's what I lead with, because you don't know what someone's journey is.
Right.
It's not something that folks have to disclose or put on a, you know, check-in sheet. So it's how you approach, you know, classes, that I think I wish that more teacher trainings included, of just opening up the awareness to you're not going to have 20-something-year-old cisgendered white skinny females in your classes all the time. And if you do, wow, okay. But I do know that a lot of teachers, especially a lot of young teachers, don't even have the language. Even if, like, let's just use me as the example. If I walk into class, sometimes they lose their minds. They don't know what to do. And I don't say I'm a yoga teacher. I just watch, and I'm here to witness, like, languaging they're using, cues that they're using that's very not accessible, or it's just horrible. It's horrible.
Or no cueing at all.
Or hands-on. Like, that's a big thing for me. Like, don't touch people without consent, please.
Yeah.
Stop doing that. And I hope that folks who listen to this or who watch this will take away, if there's anything that you can take away from this. If you are in a class and a teacher has crossed a boundary with you, please, please, please seek, you know, resources for that, because that's not supposed to be happening. And I want teachers to stop, please.
Yeah.
And on the other side of that, as a Black teacher, sometimes you don't want to touch people. because people sometimes get the wrong impression. A lot of white students do not want to be touched by somebody of color. And you
or
get
they want to
that.
be touched too much.
Yeah, there's both ends of the spectrum. But from my experience, I found that there's that, you can kind of almost feel that wall go up. You know, so I've learned how to cue, or if I see them really coming into a bad place, I'll go to them and speak to them and cue them that way without putting my hands on them. I've learned how not to touch because some people get very, very, very offended by it.
Yeah.
Like, what do you mean I'm doing it wrong?
Your experiences too. I haven't.
What do you mean I'm doing it wrong?
That long, but in my experience, it's been like a hospital setting, so I haven't had a lot of the same experiences that you have had. But I do know that touching and cueing in certain ways can really change the entire energy of the practice, and it can make or break someone's practice, how you're leading, how they are experiencing that in their body, and how they're taking the words that you're saying can totally change the entire dynamic of their practice for them. So I think it's beautiful that you guys are sharing that.
Right.
And also that you're leading practices that are bringing that to those people that might not have found that somewhere else. And I want to say too that I always hope that, you know, someone's first yoga experience isn't something that turns them off to yoga forever, because there is so much more to find. So this is one thing that I do struggle with the like all those different yoga things, like goat yoga and yoga with cats or whatever. I struggle with one way being like, oh, why would you do that? But also, hey, if this is someone's first experience with yoga and they love it and they end up going back and diving deeper into the practice, then maybe it serves a greater purpose, right?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's important.
Yeah.
You know, if I were to take my first yoga experience, it's amazing that I'm even still practicing, because it was all the things you don't do, all the things that should not be done in a class. All the elements were there. So I appreciate that there's more conversation and more education around boundaries and around all the things that just in society we should be thinking more about, you know, access and openness and consent and all the things, and just dealing with each other on a human level. You know, I'm hoping that people will start being more mindful of.
Right. But there also has to be boundaries around some of those out of the box yoga, like, you know, yoga with alcohol, or especially yoga with alcohol. Those two don't mix ever.
Yeah.
Maybe a beer after yoga you drink, but a beer and yoga, I think it leads to injury. It leads to a place that can be a bad place to be.
As someone in recovery, I think that when you're marketing something like that is supposed to be holistically empowering,
Exactly.
and you know, when you incorporate alcohol for someone who's in recovery, it's enabling. It tells me, oh, you know what, I can do yoga and drink, and it's totally okay.
Yeah.
And I think that's a dangerous precedent to set for people who are getting into.
It's an incredibly slippery slope.
Yeah.
You know, even CBD for some people and yoga, it's not a good idea.
Yeah.
Or weed.
I know students who, especially here in New York, who are like, you know, Shri, what do you think about this, like, naked yoga? And I'm just like, you know, folks are going to find a niche and like capitalize on it. But yeah, that's not a safe environment for a lot of people. And I don't really get the intention behind it.
Naked yoga?
Yeah.
I do know a few people who do teach it, and I guess their intention is to be comfortable in your own skin. And they're not mixed classes, they're women only. It was candlelit, so you're not seeing other bodies, but also just acceptance of our bodies without the yoga pants on, because, a lot of these yoga pants, and I was wearing a pair today, the ones that suck you in, which are, they're fine for a half an hour, but more than that, it's just, whoa, too much.
Yeah.
To have to fit into this certain mold, I don't need them. They're great looking pants. That's the only problem is that, I love the pants. I just don't like the fact that they push my belly in too much. I'm trying to think of the word. I can't think of the word this evening.
Compression?
Thank you. Yeah, compression pants. They're the worst. And they're everywhere now. They're the most popular pants out there. What happened to regular yoga pants?
Well, that's another business. That's a whole nother conversation. It's like yoga can turn into this conversation can turn into 10 other conversations very, very easily.
Yeah, absolutely. And talking about other conversations and things like that, I would like to invite any listeners or people viewing this video, if you have something to add to this conversation, please feel free to send your thoughts. We'd love to continue this conversation, outside of the podcast. You'll have access to all of this social media. I'll also be including contact information for Francine and Sheree if you'd like to speak with them directly. And this has been an amazing discussion. I am so grateful that you both decided to join me on the podcast. And before we go, I just wanted to ask if there were anything else that you would like to add to this conversation, any other final thoughts that you might have before we sign off.
Do yoga.
I was just gonna say, just be in your practice, and
check
if you don't,
both of us out, find us, and take our classes.
Yeah.
There's 2 Black yoga teachers right here.
Yes.
3 actually.
So nice to meet you both. Thank you, and I do hope that the conversation continues.
Thank you.
I do.
Thank you.
So we want to thank Sheree and Francine for joining us today and invite you to follow them. You can find Sheree on Facebook at facebook.com/shri.diehl. You can find Francine on Instagram at BKLYNTAYLOR. More information can also be found in the show notes, mysoberbff.com. Please follow us on Instagram at mysoberbff and engage in conversation, continue this discussion. We'd love to hear from you. Thanks so much.